All right, I'll start the recording here though. Hopefully it sounds not too bad. Welcome to week one of environment art in our little crash course here, but hopefully by the end, and I've made a promise to some of you, and I intend to keep that promise, you will have some beautiful looking environments in a really short period of time. I guarantee it's not that hard, it's just a process that you gotta kind of get with and follow, and if you stick to these rules, you'll be able to make some really nice stuff. I know some of you are already good at this, but a lot of you probably struggle with where to start, so that's how we're going to go about. So we finished a couple of these as far as the syllabus goes. This is when we're really starting with the environment art. Today's going to be a lot of collecting references. I'm going to talk about modularity. I did just briefly spoil it there, but I'm going to talk a bit about Ubisoft Next and how that can fit into this course. Specifically, I know you've already done one of the assignments, but depending on how you did, maybe you'd want the last 10 or all 15% of your lab grades to go to Ubisoft Next instead. I'm more than willing to do that. If you want to participate, we can talk about the specifics. Just reached out. All right, we'll talk a bit about asset lists, which are probably something you're not making, but should be. We'll get a little bit into getting started in Unreal and how we're actually going to get our environments started. Any questions before we get into it? Just.
What if I already have some experience with environmenting in Unreal?
I guarantee you're going to learn a ton. I have 6 years experience to share with you. There's quite a bit going on. There's a lot.
Oh.
Don't worry, you'll learn something.
Yeah.
Maybe not today because we're doing the bare bones, but really when we're doing this stuff, we've got to set ourselves up for success to the best of our ability. And the best way to do that is good proper reference, good proper management, asset listing, all that kind of stuff. It is definitely not the most exciting stuff, but it is super important to get our environments looking proper right from the get-go.
I just realized what I've been doing hasn't been environmenting. Well, it's kind of environmenting, but I did landscaping for GW.
Yeah, it's quite different. We need all these game optimizations in. So we're going to be using PureRef once again. I think I've talked to you about it already. I'm 90% sure I did. If I didn't, download it and we'll get started with it. I'd recommend you come up with an idea for an environment for your game sometime in the near future if you haven't already. So you can do this for your game instead of just making a random environment. You're also more than welcome to follow along with me in the environment I've been making. Because it goes over a lot of the details. Right, so I'm going to cover all of these things live. This is just kind of an example of the things we're going to do. So today we'll be looking for references that are good and proper. We'll be breaking down our references so we get a good idea of what pieces we need and building up an asset list that serves as kind of a visual guide for what we still need to do. Also helps us not do more work than we need, right? An environment even like this one on this picture can be broken down into a series of modular chunks extremely well, right? So even though it's such a huge grand environment, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, you can get away with like 15 pieces and build this whole environment, right? And any single one of you has the capacity to work on 15 pieces over the course of an entire semester, right? So don't be too intimidated by it. Even really big environments can be broken down. So we'll get into that. Modularity is super important. So again, we're just going to absolutely hammer home the idea of making as few props as possible. Asset lists, something you probably aren't doing at the moment typically. I don't know if Gavin introduces them. I always introduce them. If you haven't created any before, it's essentially just a working compendium of everything that you've got going on. It will grow with your project, it will change over time, and eventually all of the things will be green and you'll look at it and it'll make you happy because they're all done. So, another reason to make one is you are part of a team. I'm willing to bet. And you probably, from like the 8 million hands that went up when I asked about the artists, have other artists on your team, right? And there's a good chance you're going to need to work together while you're working through things. You might wonder where something's at or wonder what something's called, and this provides you the opportunity to go hunt it out yourself without having to rely on waiting for your teammates. So this is what it looks like, and I'll get into making it a little bit more later. I also have a template shared as well. You can grab this exact one and create your own template. Is there anyone who's interested in being a tech artist or an art director in any capacity? Few people, right? then this is all stuff that's going to be super important to you. Art directors, art tech artists, this is actually a big part of their job, unfortunately. It's not actually doing art. It's setting up all your restrictions for your other artists to follow, right? You got to get in depth with knowing the engine and what's capable. So at first we've got a bunch of different things set up for the type of asset that might need to be made, whether it's a model, material, right? If you're unfamiliar with Excel, I would recommend to learn to do this stuff, speeds things up. And this is just a visual guide, right? We have which parts we need, wall window downstairs, wall window upstairs, what kind of prop it is, or in other words, what kind of priority status we need on it. Is it a hero prop that's going to get its own unique textures? Is it a modular piece that's going to get a bunch of tiles and trims, right? All this information is good to have because it'll keep you on track while you work on a really large environment like this one, okay? For the technical people, you're going to want to be looking at your asset names and engine just to keep track of everything, right? If another artist wanted to go replace an asset and with an updated one, they need to know what it's called because facade molding might not be called facade molding in engine. Triangle count. I can't really teach this one. It's something that kind of just comes with time. And it's slowly been weaned out because of nanite. But you are supposed to optimize your meshes as much as possible, right? Pretend you're running your game on mobile. Pay attention to your polygon counts. The more you add, the more time it takes for the computer to process each frame. So it's a good idea to go in and set up hard limits for yourself when you're doing these models, right? So something like these pillars, which are a little bit more unique, I might limit myself to 2K. I haven't really gone through and done this for this because I'm not making a game, I'm just making a diorama. But next we have a similar situation with texture maps, right? People have a tendency to just throw a 4K map on everything. But if you're your team's art director or technical artist, I need you to go in and tell your team, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we're working with. And they can use this to reference that so they don't have to think about that themselves and potentially make the wrong decision. In my case, I've just got 512 ppm for everything. We'll get into what that means when we talk about UVing and textural density in a few classes. And then just status. This is, again, mostly for other people. I have it here because I'm just filling this out as if, you know, there was a whole team, even though it's just me. I would highly recommend you go ahead and grab this template, which I should probably download and upload the slides, so you can do that. So you just make a copy of your own, and then you'll be able to change it in any way you want, right? Really, those sections I have set up, they're there because that's what works for me. You can add whatever you'd like, and should add whatever you'd like. We are in week 7, 8. All right. Oops. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about scale consistency. We are human beings, and when we make environments with real-world scale, it's very easy to tell when things are wrong, and it becomes sort of out of proportion very, very, very quick. I talked about this a little bit when we were doing our desk, right? When we set up our desk block out and we tied it to our character. We didn't actually model it to real-world scale directly. We modeled it to the human scale. Right, so if people are looking at this, they're a lot less likely to sort of latch on to like, hey, this is wrong, right? Where if you try to model something to the exact dimensions, it's a lot more familiar to people typically, and when it's more familiar, it's easier for them to spot mistakes. These two pillars, this one is a proper size pillar, and then this next one is scaled up, not by much, not even like, I think it's like 14% wider, really. It's really not a lot, but already it just looks totally wrong. And you can imagine if you took other things and modeled them to that pillar as you went, it would just continue to get more and more out of hand. So we're going to build this up right from the beginning, and it's something we'll talk about right away. You need a human reference of some capacity. I highly recommend if you don't have an art library already, you start to build up that kind of thing. It comes in handy down the line for all sorts of projects. Having something like an external drive is super useful. In my case, if I pop that open, you see there's an art library with all kinds of things, extra alphas, extra materials, extra things going on, rigs from Blender, all these kind of things you can kind of hold on to. Topology reference, somewhere, human scale, right? And we have our human scale rig that we can just put in any project right at the very beginning. So grab one of these, find something. It doesn't have to be anything. In truth, the one I use the most is Near from, or 2B from Near, because the first project I ever did was a Near environment, so I just used hers to make it all scale, and then just said screw it and kept using it. So you can find something you like, use it over and over, just have it in your back pocket. As I said earlier, I'm going to be using Unreal because it's probably what I'm most familiar with for this stuff, and all of the things that I talk about here, with the exception of specifically how materials work, will apply to any other program you choose to use. Hell, you could do this in Godot if you really wanted to. They have normal map support, so you can do it if you wanted. I wouldn't recommend it because it won't look very good compared to everything else, but you can. Okay. So what environment are we going to do? So I have chosen to take a crack at the Trinity College Library for a good number of reasons. For this class, there's a lot of repetition, which means we can get away with much fewer props and create a much grander environment, which is important, because again, we only have 6 weeks. There are a lot of very intricate ornamental details, right? And they're all part of the Corinthian order, which means we have like proper architectural reference to look on as we go about things. It's fairly simple to break down because the different pieces are very obvious, which helps a lot as well. I think it looks cool, always important. If you don't have the motivation to do it, you probably won't. And they have relatively simple materials overall. We are going to put a twist on this, and I might get into VFX if we have the time. That's a storytelling beat, though. We'll touch on that later. Another thing that's really good is there's a ton of online reference for an environment like this. If you are making a game, which you are, you probably have environments that are either based on real world or that you've made up. The issue with environments that you've made up is unless you've got somebody on your team who's gathering a ton of reference, putting it all together, making an art Bible, setting up like proper drawn references for you to go in and break down, you're going to struggle a lot more to make that kind of thing happen. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's a lot easier to kind of start closer to reality and move your way further away as you get better at this stuff. All right. The other thing in this environment is there's a lot of trim sheets, which are going to be very important to adding details later, and you've probably never used them before, so this will be an introduction and a mastering of it all in one. All right, any questions regarding what we're doing?
What if you're not in a
That's okay.
Too bad.
Just make an environment in Unreal.
Because like earlier you said that, sorry, like if you have like no one do environments, like okay, you understand.
If you don't have then don't pick something in fantasy. Pick something in reality where you can find a lot of good reference images, so that you don't have to go make some.
Wait,
and then,
so you're saying we should grab images for our GW games?
well, you should already have reference for your GW games.
Oh, okay, fair. But
If you haven't, we'll take a look at getting good references now. So I'm going to open PureRef, and we'll get started for real.
yeah, the environment that I'm thinking of, it takes place on the moon.
You can find good references of the moon. There are a lot of photos of the moon.
I mean, yeah.
So this is my PureRef file, and this is typically how I would break things down if I'm going about it. Really, Google or artists do whatever they want. You can do whatever you want to do when it comes to breaking things down. But this is typically what you're going to be looking for as you go about your environment. So we've got what are called, first and foremost, our primary references. And so I'm just going to go ahead and Google, right? So in this case, I'm working on the Trinity College Library. If we go to images, obviously there's going to be a ton of images, but that doesn't mean all of them are going to be actually useful for us. Case in point, this one's not very good. What you want to do first is pick a few core images that really speak to what you want your project to feel like as it comes to its conclusion. So in this case, I've got pictures that really emphasize that barrel sealing and that really emphasize the length and just details of the space. So these are all things that we are going to be focusing on, and all of our other references are going to build up what's in our core references. It's really important you get a lot of these, and it's also really important you don't stop collecting references. Always more will come up as you go throughout the project. So I picked these core references, and then from there move into doing specific parts. So if I take a look, right, we've got this long hall, these bookshelves, and we've got all these little units that repeat over time. So realistically, we know we only have to model one of these units and it will just repeat all the way down, which is super convenient. So we can get in and grab specific for those units to see what they look like inside. Here we go. Whoop. Right, we could take a look at the books specifically. Those are a key portion. The lighting is going to be important. It gets its own section with references, right? People. Something that's often overlooked is you're probably looking for references without people, usually because they kind of get in the way of the things you're trying to see. But the references with people are going to be just as important, because typically it's going to be people that you're scaling your environment around. So the more people you have, the more times you can look at and say, hey, right, this dude looks like an average height dude. Maybe he's a little bit taller. When he stands next to this thing, he's about the same height as it, and that's about the same height as Shakespeare's chin, right? And I could probably fit 3 of him at the height of this pillar, maybe 2.5. So having a bunch of photos with people in them is really important as well. Each individual detail will get a bunch of reference that you can use throughout your project. Now the secret sauce of finding good reference is if you are someone who's doing something based on a real world environment, Google Maps has probably been there already, and they probably have all kinds of things going on. So if I click this Google Maps link that I've added to my peer ref here, people love walking around famous places with 360-degree cameras. That they do. And that is great for us because now we just get 360-degree images that are loading very slowly of the spaces, right? So this is a fantastic resource for looking around, checking the scale of things, checking how details that you can't normally see fit together, right? And it all builds up into a better project if you really pay attention at this stage. So another thing that we're going to do at this reference stage is think a little bit more about sort of the history of our space, whether it's fictional or real, because there'll always be some level of inspiration in a space that fits some other order, right? In this case, we've got a lot of these statues, and you'll notice we have in the details right, we have a ton of these intricate and ornamental details all throughout the space. But this specifically, after a little bit more research, we might find out that that's actually the Corinthian order, which is an old Roman style of architecture. And your spaces, no matter where they are from, are going to have some form of old references like this, right? Nothing is truly new. But this is fantastic because something like this order is heavily documented. Right down to specific sizes, angles, everything is there for you to nab. So you can go ahead and take this orthographic image and you could model right to it if you wanted to. If you're doing a Roman environment, I would highly recommend you do something like that. If you're doing a Viking environment, you can do the same thing, but you're looking for the Viking architectural references instead. It doesn't have to be specifically like this. This is just the example we're going with. But think about your environment you're making and think about where it roots from, where its inspirations are. Something like this, I mean, these are from like thousands of years ago, but that library is from like the 1800s. So it doesn't matter where your influence is from, but try to find the core influence because you'll have a better time figuring out what you need to do. Okay. So with that out of the way, I've already collected the references. I'm not going to go through collecting the references with you because that's boring. We have the general idea. The last thing I'm going to mention is finding parts that aren't even related really to the scene you're building. In this one, I noted that it actually has a long history. It used to have a very flat top ceiling like this one before they went ahead and added that second level and that barrel ceiling, right? And this is a very, very old library. So I'm not going to be modeling this as if it's modern day. I'm going to be taking it back in time to when it was actually used, and I'm going to be throwing a fantasy element in there of, if I pull it up, there's this crystal ball in here, and we'll add a bunch of papers flying around and VFX and everything down the line, right? So again, when I was saying earlier about trying to base your fantasy in reality to give you the best shot at making something look good, that's kind of along the lines of what I meant, right? I'm not going to build up the fantasy right from scratch. I'm going to take real world influence, and then I'm going to add my fantasy elements to it afterwards, right? This obviously not something real. There was no witchcraft going on in this building, I don't think. But we're going to add some just for effect. Okay. So with that done, I've already gone ahead and gotten ahead of this project because doing it all live, obviously there's no shot of that happening in time. So I'll open up my file first to give you an idea of how we're going to break things down, and then I'll start a new file and we'll get started. Okay, so this is where we're at. This is what your file should typically look like for the most part. You're going to be working with a lot of stuff. It's very important we keep our files organized right from the get-go because there are a million things in our files, and when we export them, they use the world center. So instead of making a bunch of different files, which I know a lot of you do, we're going to try and work in one, right? But first, what we're going to do is build up our reference. In this case, it's just 2B because that's the scale reference I had lying around. We're going to make sure their height is something appropriate for an actual human being. In this case, 170 centimeters. And from there, we'll build up our environment. So I've got this one called test. You can see this is where we kind of put everything together. So this workflow is going to involve first just making our environment and ignoring most of the game stuff. It's way easier to be creative when you're not limited to these heavy restrictions technically. So let's just get started with making an environment that fits the size, roughly. So I'll close this and start over. We'll grab our scale reference. Delete those. Add a cube. Okay, so here's my scale reference. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and grab this. I've just got it in this other Blender file, but it's always here, so I can copy it from one Blender file and just paste it in the other one. Okay, it comes with a rig and everything. This is the one from Unreal. You can get the one from Unity, Unreal, whatever. Just find something that's approximately the right size. In this case, we open up our panel. He's a little bit tall, 183 centimeters, but he's still very much human sized. I'm going to delete the rig, which in turn is going to break everything. But that's okay. We're just going to scale it down 100. That's just how Unreal's that's just because of Unreal's like using centimeters instead of meters. Okay, so we can scale them up, and I'm just paying attention to that z-axis until he's about the right height. So we'll go 1.8 about human size. Perfect. Apply scale. Great. Right off the bat, I'm going to grab him, and I'm just going to move him to a new collection, call it reference. You'll notice I did this in the modeling stuff as well. It's the exact same stuff. I just like to mark it red so we know it's here at any given time, and turn on the selections so we don't accidentally select them all the time. And I should turn this on, even though it only half works. There we go. Okay. From here, we can start to work on building up whatever environment we're working on. In this case, we're working on that library. So I can go ahead and start getting piece by piece everything together. So we'll start with the cube because it's nice and simple. It's always easy to start with the floor. So let's just start with the floor. One thing is when we're thinking about it now early, or if we think about it now early, breaking these pieces down bit by bit, it becomes a lot easier later to make proper modular kit pieces, right? So the process is going to be model out our environment in Blender, import that entire environment into Unreal just to get an idea of the feel, size, and everything else. Unreal has a default player character that we'll be using to explore the space. If you start with the third-person template, so here if I go ahead and open it up, right, we can walk around the space and get a good feel of how it's going to be. If you have an actual game, that's even better because you can put your actual player character in here and get a feel for how they feel in the space. So I'm already thinking about working modularly for the most part. So because of that, I'm going to build up pieces in a way that makes sense for later. I'm not just going to take this cube and extrude it out a bunch. We'll use this cube over and over. There's one more thing I need to do though. We're working on Unreal Engine, which uses centimeters, not meters. So I need to go to my Blender settings. Here's one of these. And change my units from meters to centimeters. So you see now this object is no longer 2 meters by 2 meters, it is 200 centimeters by 200 centimeters, right? So this is much more in line with Unreal, which really helps keep things organized. So I'm going to leave my floor with a little bit of thickness, but I really don't need that much, and it doesn't need to make sense. Next is the origin point stuff. We want our origin points to always be on some corner so that when we tile these pieces together, it tiles nicely all throughout, right? So this is nice and simple. We'll start with the floor. When we're building this up, we want to start thinking about textile density roughly. Yep.
So with the scaling, what like metric do you usually work on? Like 1 meter, 2 meters, 4 meters per grid piece? Is it a combination of all of that?
I'll mention that right now. So when I'm thinking about this, now you should be thinking this ahead of time. This is getting ahead of ourselves. We'll get more in depth later. But there's an idea of textile density. And this is going to play a huge role in everything you do down the line. Your trim sheet should be a certain texture. Your material should be a certain texture size. And that all lines up with your material directly. So if we hop back to my asset list I made, you notice I have this thing that says 512 ppm here. That means for every meter of real world space, I will have 512 pixels, right? So if I have a 1 meter long cube, it needs a 512 by 512 size map to fit that textile density. In this case, this is a very large environment, and I want to minimize the amount of textures that I have and the amount of tiling that I have, right? I think 4K, if we do a 4K at 512 ppm, then that's going to be 8 meters, I think. Or is it 16? Either way, it's too big. So for us, if we make this block here, 4 meters by 4 meters, at 512 ppm, right? 4 times 512, we end up with one 2K map. And we know that everything fits on a 2K map on this plane. So I've chosen ahead of time, and this is where your tech artist would come in, is you would pick some kind of textile density, choose some kind of standard map size. In my case, I picked 2K, and work from there. So I want my pieces to be about 4 meters long. All right, that's how I've come to that conclusion. If you have a very small environment, you might use pieces that are 1 meter long, and you might use 512 maps, right? It's not something I can really teach you. You've kind of just got to experiment and see what looks good, what doesn't. If you use something that's too small, you're going to end up with a ton of tiling, right? This is even kind of too small. It's somewhere in the gap between too small and just right. It tiles endlessly, way too much along most of my props where we don't want tiling, right? So this is probably one bit too small, but I also know that a 4K would be far too big. So this is a happy middle ground, and we can work from that. The other thing this means, though, is because you're making it easier on yourself later, your real world scale is not always going to be perfectly accurate. For example, these pillars here, in order for everything to fit onto my maps properly, I've made them 6 meters tall, and these arcade sections, as they're called, are 6 meters tall, so that it all fits on the maps nice and easily. How tall are they in real life? I really don't know. And really, it doesn't matter as long as they fit to our grid system and it looks good with the player beside them, which is why we're just modeling to human scale and not to exact proportions. So I'll take my floor here. I'll just move it off to the side. And I know from doing this already that we're roughly looking at a space that's this wide, right? And I'm just having my player kind of stand next to it so we can get a pretty good idea of that. At this stage, it is modular, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. I have alt-D'd these so that they'll all change together. But then I'm just going to come in here and add an array modifier just to fill out the rest of the space, just for convenience and time's sake, right? I don't want to sit here all day making these, so we'll do something like this. Okay, and we know we can use a constant offset of 4 meters, so 400 centimeters, and we can just copy that modifier over, and we have a good distance to start everything from, right? So next from this stage, what we'll do is start building up some walls. And again, I'm not worried too much about fitting everything onto the grid entirely, but I just want to quickly move the origin point over and then start kind of building up a wall. So I'm not too concerned with the specifics. I just know I want it to be 4 meters long. We can worry about the height later. I'll snap it into place and I'll do the same thing. Okay, and we can start to build up our wall. I'm not really worried about anything yet. I'll leave it at 600, and then I'll explain why we get to 600 later. Duplicate it again, move it around. We're not too worried about specifics right now. What we're going to do later is take all of these different pieces and make proper kits out of them. For now, we're just blocking things out, right? At this point, what I'm going to do is take this, export it, and put it in Unreal Engine right away. So I'll just save this scene. We'll hop into another one. I'm using an old version of Unreal 2, so there's like a very good chance this like just crashes and burns at some point. Just get rid of all this stuff. Great. So let's take this object, and I'm not going to worry too much about anything. I'm just going to open FBX, set it to selected only. Actually, we'll go over this too. You're working on a team and you all need to be using the same export settings to make sure everything's consistent. I imagine you're all using Blender for the most part, so this would be a great time to build up your own presets and share it with your team. So you'll see up here, I've got one already for one of my 4th year teams for Unity for static meshes, right? So anytime I wanted to, I could just click that and it would automatically set everything up. And I knew my whole team who was exporting from Blender was exporting consistently together. I don't want to export that one because we're not doing that. So for Unreal, there are a few things we can change. Generally, we want to change our normals to face. And we want to just take off anything related to armatures. You can play around with these settings if you're unhappy with how they show up in the viewport. But generally, they don't affect how it shows up in Engine. So I'll go ahead and just click the Add button once I'm happy with it. And we'll just call this Library Project, because each project might have its own. But now, every time I go to export, I can click Library Project. I can share that preset with my team, and they can do the same thing. And I can export to wherever I just exported that to. So,
appears to be
yeah, it's got
documents, because
yeah.
Did you name it?
Yeah, well, it's going into the actual project. So finding the Unreal project, content, meshes, and this is going to be SM for static mesh, and this will just be test piece 2 because I already did test piece 1 when I was building it. Okay, we're gonna have the option to import it. I already changed a lot of this. By default, you're going to want to make sure that combined meshes is on. Otherwise, it'll import all of these separately, which is not what you want. So combined meshes we're going to leave on. And everything else is pretty much good for now. I set import material off because we're going to build our own materials later. So do not create material. We'll worry about that later. Import textures off. We'll worry about all of that later. So now right away we can go grab it, drop it into our scene, and just zero it out. Whoop. I'm also just going to add this default cube here. And I'm just going to scale it up roughly to the size of our space. And make sure it has collision. It should already. There we go. And now we can walk around our space super simply. I'm not worried about all the details. I just want to walk around a little bit so we can get a feel of proportion, right? So this feels fine. We can even go in and hide that cube. We just want the collision. Man, Unreal and OBS do not run well together.
It's almost like they both use graphics.
Yeah, it's pretty intense on this thing. Yeah. Great. And we'll just continue building this up piece by piece, going from our largest chunks to our smallest chunks. So as we look through our references, right, I'm taking a peek around, taking a peek. We know we've got these bookshelves that are going to be between each of these, what are called arcades. We're going to have these pillars sticking out as well. So that can be our next place to go. We're not worrying about any details yet at all, not one. Right? Except I am going to start looking at my scale. So I've got these humans here. They're all roughly average height, we'll just say. And that makes it easy to sort of get a gauge of how tall everything is. So we know from something like this dude, if he was standing right up against this wall in perspective, you could probably fit roughly 3 of him up the height of these bookshelves, right? As we go about it. It doesn't need to be perfect. We still want to fit as much to our grid as possible. But we know we can fit roughly 3 of this dude, right? If we want a nice even number, which we do, I'm just going to assume this dude is 2 meters tall. He's definitely not, but we'll assume he is. So we can assume then that these bookshelves get up to about 6 meters high. I don't know what the actual number is, and again, I don't care. All we're going to do is make them 6 meters tall, go into our project here, and make sure that 6 meters tall feels about right beside our player character, right? And this seems to feel pretty accurate. It's maybe a little bit tall, but once we add more of our block out in, we'll be able to tell for sure.
It looks a little short, honestly.
There's no roof or anything. It'll come to. Right, and I'm just going to keep working in that exact same way. So let's move the origin point on this cube. And I'm still just using increment snapping right now to move around the scene. It just helps keep things in these giant 1 meter chunks, which for right now is all we need. So let's go ahead and plop this bookshelf in here. I'm not going to worry about it clipping or anything. We might want to move the origin point somewhere. Right, so the origin point on these ones, we know we want them to go in between our chunks. So I'm going to put the origin point in between so it kind of sits over each. I made a hotkey for it. Otherwise, you have to go select an edge, Shift S, move your cursor there. Then you have to go object mode, click up here, click set origin, click origin to 3D cursor. I'd recommend you just go to here, and then you can, if you right click, add to quick favorites, and then it shows up under Q, and it's just there. I have extra stuff because of hard ops, but I think if default Blender, you just click Q and it's right there.
Yes. Thank you.
No problem. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to move this loosely into place. Once again, because of our scale and everything, I want to make this about 4 meters. We know that that's pretty standard size for most of this stuff. And we'll scale it up. Copy that array. All right, and we can tell for sure these are definitely not the right size, but that's okay. Scale them down on Y quite a bit, just for now, something like that. To make life easier, I'm going to add an empty. And just put it in the center of the world. And I'm just going to call this my mirror root. And then instead of duplicating this over, I can just add a mirror to it at the mirror root. Right? We see how quickly we can build up this space. It hasn't been very long at all. I'm going to grab all of these and move them up, or duplicate them up, sorry, to get our second floor roughly in place. We might want to change these down the line, but for now we'll just go with that. And I'm going to duplicate these and bring them up. Right, not pictured here is a lot of looking at your references and everything to sort of get these shapes down. We already know, or I've already done this, so we know how it all builds up. But we can take a look at each of the sections, right? Get our pictures of the upstairs. We know that the bookshelves, they go right up, and then there's a second floor, and then there's another bookshelf on top. So we can go ahead and get into those details as well, just by taking our bookshelf and kind of duplicating it on top. Right? We do know that this bookshelf and this bookshelf are actually different in the way they're built, right? It's pretty easy to tell they're not the same. And this is where we can kind of make that choice when we're talking about breaking down references and building up our asset list, right? I could have decided to just use the same bookshelf. If you're low on time, low on budget, that's something you might choose to do. I've chosen to go a higher fidelity with this, so I've chosen to make them separate, right? But when you go to break down your references, think about this kind of thing. Is it worth the time and effort you're going to have to put into building these pieces to separate them? Even though I'm deciding yes, because we're blocking things out, I don't care. They get the same treatment as everything else. It's the same thing. Right? And now we have our general kind of shape. I'm just going to re-export it again. You always want to be moving in and out of Engine to sort of get a good idea of how things feel. So export that in. It'll update real quick in Editor. We can come in and get a feel for it again, right? Are these too thick? Are they too thin? We can kind of figure that out as we go. Right, but right now it doesn't look too bad. All right. From here, we keep working from big to small. So the next big detail is probably going to be these massive curved arch roofs, right? So I'm really quickly just going to make some massive curved arch roofs. None of this is final. This is all blockout work, right? Don't be afraid to come back later. We're going to be iterating on this as the semester goes on. For now, we're just getting a sense of everything. So let's open Blender back up here. And this is going to look really stupid, and it's not going to fit properly. But for now, just to get an idea, it's just fine. So I've got a cylinder with 16 sides, should be probably enough. We'll move it roughly into place. I'm just going to rotate it here. I'm not really covering the modeling techniques. That's something you kind of got to explore on your own. But wow, now we have half a cylinder, which happens to work fantastically as a roof piece. So I'm going to move my origin to the corner, right? Whichever corner makes the most sense for having it fit into place, like so. And then we can just loosely scale it up until it fits. This fitment doesn't really look entirely right, so we'll look at our references and see how it fits, where it comes down. Right? We can see it comes down about halfway down that bookshelf before the other one, and they kind of connect in the middle. So we'll snap this over to about halfway between this bookshelf, and then we'll scale it up from its origin, until it's about halfway through that other bookshelf. All right, again, I'm not being super precise with this, but we know it's roughly going to be 4 meters here as well. Just for example, so it looks a bit more thick in space, we'll hit it with a solidify. And give it the same treatment. Other way around. Export and take a peek. Okay, but now we can go back and think about the sense of everything, how it feels next to our reference, how it feels compared to these people, right? Our bookshelves at the moment are quite wide still, it feels like, compared to the person. Maybe just a smidge. We can look at the width of these pillars and bookshelves to sort of get an idea of how wide they might be next to a person. Right? We can say maybe they're 1 meter wide just to make things nice and simple. So if we go double check our walls here, see they're 84 centimeters wide. We'll just lower it down to 80 and see how that feels. Barely changed. We'll lower it down to 60. See how that feels. A little thin. We'll just call it at 75. Great. Now we can start to move on to working on things like our pillars. So this is another one of those places where our origin point's going to get a little bit weird, right? I want the pillars. They're almost always going to be in front of these bookshelves, right? So it makes the most sense for the pivots of those to be somewhere that'll help me line them up with the bookshelf. So putting them in the halfway here, or some artists will like to actually put it in the same place. So because they're always tied, the origin point for the pillar might even be back here, where the origin point for the bookshelf is. So that when you're working an engine, what you can do is just duplicate it, let go of it, so it's in the exact same spot, and then just switch which mesh it is, right? And you'll just place the pillar right where it goes. I prefer to work a little bit more granularly, so I'm going to separate it. So from here, let's add another cube, and this will be as the base of our pillar. So we'll move that into place. And again, very loosely, just start getting it shapely. These pillars, because they aren't really connected to anything or aren't the foundation of our environment, they can kind of be whatever size we want them to be, right? They don't have to specifically fit to the grid width-wise or depth-wise. Height, we might want to make sure that they also fit in some capacity into that 2 or 4 meter space. But as far as the width compared to the bookshelves and everything, we can do whatever we want. So grab this pillar and just scale it down granularly. We know that there's a bit of a gap with the bookshelves, so something like this is fine. And then the top part, like I said, we want to try and stay as much as we can in our grid space. So I might want to make them about 4. Right? And if it feels too short, maybe it does, we can raise them up a little bit more. On top of the pillars, we know from our Corinthian order and everything else, we have this facade that sits on top, as well as from our reference, because we have good detail reference, we can see we have the pillar, and then that's going to lead up to this extra detail here. So we can go ahead and work on something like that next. We also know our floor sits about here at the top of this facade. So we need to have enough space between the top of our pillar and the second floor, which we've already blocked out, right? But we can always change this later. If we wanted to make this space taller, we could. We could even go as far as to make this floor different from the bottom one. And if we make this floor a meter thick, the other way, that also gives us the opportunity to raise the entire height of everything a meter, if we feel we're running out of space, right? So there are an infinite number of ways you can kind of get this set up and change things down the line if you don't feel like things are working out too well. So we're going to very loosely block out this pillar. That's it. And then we'll work on that facade. So for now, the idea is going to be identical. Right, we know we need this to be about 4 meters long. So I'm going to use the snapping to snap it to everything else. We know it comes up to about the height of our second floor. So we can move it out to fit, right? So So we take a look, 400 long, yep.
So when do we care and not care about intersection?
Generally speak, at this stage, we don't at all. Right, we're just blocking things out right now, so I literally could care less what intersects. Even in, like, as we continue, there will still be things that intersect. Even if I hop over here to the, like, where it's at proper, you'll still find places. But you'll also find environment art a lot. We do just kind of crash things into other things to help with just keeping things quick and dirty. These are just smashed together. I think there's a bunch of Zed fighting on some stuff over here. My computer is struggling to render anything though. Right, but you can see things fighting. Like here. Really, what it comes down to is, will the player notice it? And if the answer is no, we don't care. That's essentially where it comes down. If it's a detail that's really close to the camera, like if I had this crystal ball and I had it just absolutely shoved through the table, people would notice and it would not be good. But these pillars are colliding into those bookshelves. Those ladders are going through the floor to some extent. What else? All kinds of things, right? If we really wanted to clean it up, we can come back and clean things up later. So let's go back. So our facade here, again, super loose blockout. We know it has this top section that kind of sticks out, goes back in, and then kind of trickles down to at the end of our bookshelf. And if we look from a top view, you can see we have it also kind of stick out. This is another place where having those good references comes in, because again, we know it's the Corinthian order. I could always just hop in here, find literally to scale the guide for a Corinthian order facade and make it to scale. But in this case, I'm not. Just for the sake of time, we'll just say it's close enough. Let's grab this and bring it out. Something like that. Again, we're not too worried about the specifics. We just know it goes out and in and down. So we need to go out. Oops. In. And then down. Okay, we can work just like this for now. That's more or less enough, probably. We can add one more ridge here, just by beveling. Beveling again, and then pulling our edges out. Right, but super bare bones for right now. And already we can kind of see, just because our human reference is here, right? I'll move them closer. This doesn't feel super right. It looks way too thick compared to our human. When we go back to our human references here, it looks very thin at the bottom. And it looks far too tall, right? This pillar should be much taller than this section. So at the moment we have way too much of it. So we'll just shrink this in, move it back, raise our pillar to boot. Right, it's looking a little bit better. And I'm just gonna do the same thing. Copy that modifier. Now it's there. Copy that modifier. Now it's there. Great. 310. You can probably get a few more things blocked out. It's very early steps, but this is where you see the most progress, so it can be kind of fun. I'll show you a little bit of more advanced modeling stuff here. This one's kind of fun. So you'll notice we also have these little intermediary parts of the facade that sit on top of the pillar, right? So we have the actual facade going in here, and then we have the pillar sticking out. But I want them to be perfectly in line as they would be. I'm gonna grab this and just move it over. This is a Shift D this time instead of Alt, because this is gonna be a different piece. Just gonna move it somewhere I can work on it. Get rid of that modifier. Okay. You can do some weird stuff with this where you could potentially shear it 45 degrees and then extrude it back or whatever. But that's kind of destructive, which isn't always great. So another weird thing you can do is take it, and I'm not a huge fan of where the origin point is on either of them, so I'm just going to change it real quick. Okay. But you can use the mirror modifier to kind of angle and cut things in weird ways. So as we know, the mirror modifier is going to use our origin point, but if you hit Control period, you bring up origin transformation mode. And what this lets you do is move the origin instead of the object itself. So you can rotate the origin by some amount without affecting the facade here. So if I add a mirror modifier to this now, say on Y for example, and I was to start rotating this, we can actually get directional mirrors like this. So now if I was to kind of take this and shear it out by some amount, we get something a lot nicer to work with. So again, origin, and we get our nice little corner piece that still completely follows our proper angles, right? Oops. So I'm going to quickly just apply that mirror. Move my origin point. And then mirror it again on the other side. And now we've got our piece. Yep.
What's that pivot mode called again? Edit pivot mode? Because I want to change the binding.
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I just know it's Control period. If you want to search by binding.
Search for the key binding.
Yeah. I know Maya has something very similar that's very convenient.
Yeah.
It's a little bit less useful in Blender, but there are situations like this one where it's very useful. But now we can take this piece and move it into place. So we'll take it down to our pillar and then move it up. And again, for right now, I don't care too much about the intersecting or anything. Grab it, rinse and repeat. We're slowly building up a good space. So I imagine you've, for the most part, got the process by now, as I've done the same thing 13 times. Oops. I actually want the origin of these to be on top of the pillar, so I can quickly move it to the top of the pillar. And again, working in big chunks, so the next biggest chunk here is probably going to be this barrel ceiling. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did for the other ones. Let's add a cylinder. Get it in place loosely. It's not even going to be perfect. Scale it up for now. until it's roughly in the right place. And give it the same treatment as everything else. Set the origin point, snap it into place. And in this case, I need to extrude these down so that we have something to boolean out. Slap some thickness on it, shade it smooth. And let's make sure it's 4 meters long, just like everything else. Whoop. Okay, and there we go. I'm going to quickly just duplicate both of these and move it up. Oh, sorry. I just want to duplicate this. Get rid of these. And I'm just going to quickly boolean it out. Super roughly. Topology at this stage is another thing we really don't care about. I'm moving the origin back to the center quickly to just mirror it, and then we'll put it back where it belongs. And rinse and repeat the modifiers again. Oh, there we go. There we go. Nice barrel ceiling. Just forgot to apply the scale. Probably time now to get this in engine. All right. You can see the UE5 mannequin, the UE4 mannequin, they're basically the same, so it doesn't really matter which one, right? But in the span of less than an hour, we've made essentially our entire block out roughly, right? There's definitely more I would do, but we have 10 minutes left, so this is the idea though. You're gonna be moving origin points around after you break your meshes down and kind of get everything in place. Next week, we're going to start refining these blockout meshes into something more final, I believe is the plan. I'll double check that real quick. Yeah, so next week we're gonna block this out properly. So whereas right now I've been working with blocks just, because I'm thinking ahead, but generally you could just make your environment as is, and then we'll break it down into proper kit pieces where we set the origin points for real. We set everything up to be actually in engine as their own piece, right? So right now, obviously, this is all just one piece, but we're gonna want to go in at some point and break everything down into each individual piece and build our level in Editor instead of building our level in Blender. And that'll help us iterate on things much faster later, right? So I can't continue, obviously, but if I was to continue, we just keep breaking down big piece by big piece, right? Next would be these big railings up here. Then we do the second story pillars. Then probably these arches here, right? These smaller pillars where the statues go on, etc., etc., etc. Right? Then these pieces in between. And finally, something like the stairwell. Something like the stairwell, just roughly blocked out. So I hope this kind of gives you an idea of how to start your environments. You can get something done really quickly. Are there any questions as we wrap up? I'll be doing my same old, so office hours. I don't have office hours, but I now kind of unofficially do for this duration of the semester, where I'll just be in the game lab for the next like hour and a half, basically. So if you do have questions but you can't think of them right away, just come on down. You can ask them there. Cool. So yeah, no major questions right now. All right. Then we'll pick this back up next week.